Imagine it's August 2003. You're a 38-year-old project manager named David living in a suburb of Detroit, Michigan. You have a comfortable house in a good school district. You have two cars in the driveway, a Toyota Camry you own outright, and a Ford F-150 you're still paying off. You have a chest freezer in the basement stocked with roughly $400 worth of meat and vegetables. You have a home security system you pay $45 a month for, monitored by a company in Atlanta. You have a generator listed on your insurance policy as a declared asset. You have a cell phone, a landline, a cable subscription, and a broadband connection that in 2003 still feels miraculous. On the afternoon of August 14th at 4:11 p.m. Eastern Time, a software bug in an Ohio utilities alarm system fails to alert operators to a sagging transmission line. The line touches a tree. A cascade begins. Within 90 seconds, 256 power plants across 8 U.S. states and Ontario go offline. 55 million people lose power simultaneously. It is the largest blackout in North American history. By hour 6, your freezer has stopped freezing. By hour 18, the meat is beginning to turn. By hour 24, you've discovered that your generator requires a part that every hardware store within 40 miles has sold out of. By hour 48, your home security system is offline, the monitoring center unreachable, and the panel on your wall is nothing but a dark plastic rectangle. By hour 72, you're standing in your garage surrounded by everything you own and you're beginning to understand something that no one told you when you bought any of it. Not one purchase you made to make your life more secure is making you more secure right now. Not the freezer, not the security system, not the generator, not the smart home devices, not the emergency kit you ordered online 2 years ago and never actually opened. Everything worked, right until it didn't. This is not a story about the 2003 Northeast blackout, though that event is documented, studied, and still cited by infrastructure engineers today. It is a story about a category of collapse that is distinct from the economic collapses this channel has examined before, and in some ways more immediately relevant to the daily decisions most people are making right now. A 72-hour grid collapse is not a currency crisis. It is not a sovereign debt implosion. It is not a war. It is something more mundane and more likely. A failure of the electrical infrastructure that modern life has been built around so completely, so invisibly, that most people don't consciously know it exists until the moment it stops. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The United States power grid is, depending on which infrastructure analyst you ask, either aging, fragile, or already failing in slow motion. There have been over 180 significant power disturbances in the U.S. in 2023 alone. NARC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, has repeatedly warned that large portions of the country face elevated risk of energy shortfalls under normal peak demand conditions. The Texas grid failure of February 2021 killed over 250 people and caused an estimated $200 billion in damage. It lasted in some areas for more than a week. The 2003 Northeast blackout cost an estimated $6 billion and lasted up to 4 days in some regions. These events are not anomalies, they are data points in a trend, and the trend is toward more frequent, more severe, and longer duration outages in countries whose entire economic and social infrastructure was designed assuming uninterrupted power. But here is what this analysis is about. Not the infrastructure, not the policy failures, not the politics of energy investment. It's about the purchases, the specific things that middle-class households have been sold on the premise that they create security, resilience, and preparedness, and that a 72-hour grid collapse renders not merely less useful, but actively, demonstrably useless. The mechanism is different from economic collapse, but the cruelty is identical. In an economic collapse, purchases become useless because the financial architecture around them fails. In a grid collapse, purchases become useless because the electrical architecture around them fails. And just as with economic collapse, the purchases most likely to fail are the ones most aggressively marketed as smart, responsible, and forward-thinking, the ones you were encouraged to buy, the ones that felt like upgrades. Let's go through them. Not as speculation, as autopsy. The smart home was sold to an entire generation of middle-class consumers as the future of domestic security and efficiency. Smart locks, smart thermostats, smart doorbells, smart lighting, smart appliances, smart security cameras with cloud storage and remote monitoring, smart irrigation systems, smart garage door openers, smart smoke detectors that send alerts to your phone. Every one of these devices was marketed on the premise of greater control, greater awareness, and greater safety. And in a functioning grid, within the operational parameters those devices were designed for, many of them deliver exactly what they promise. Then the grid goes down, and here is what actually happens, not in theory, but in documented reality, verified by every grid failure event in the past 20 years. Smart locks that require a Wi-Fi connection or a functional cloud server to operate become either permanently locked or permanently unlocked, depending on their failure mode, when the internet connection drops. In the 2021 Texas freeze, homeowners reported being unable to enter or exit their own homes because the lock's battery had died in the cold and the app-based backup had no signal. In other cases, locks failed to the open position, leaving homes unsecured for days. Smart security cameras stop recording the moment the grid fails. Most consumer-grade systems have no backup power. The cloud servers that store footage depend on data centers that have generator backup for core operations, but often throttle consumer services within the first 24 hours. Your camera is a sightless eye. Your notification system is silent. The app tells you the device is offline and offers you the opportunity to troubleshoot. Smart thermostats cannot regulate temperature without power. This would be an obvious point, except that millions of people have replaced their manual thermostats, devices that had no electrical dependency beyond a single AA battery, with devices that require a continuous internet connection and a powered HVAC system to function. In a winter grid failure, this is not a convenience loss. In certain climates, it becomes a survival issue within 48 hours. Smart appliances, refrigerators with touchscreen interfaces, ovens with app controls, washing machines with Wi-Fi diagnostics stop functioning entirely, not partially. Not in degraded mode. They are off. And because many of them are designed to integrate with the grid for peak hour power management, some require a software restart sequence that only works when connectivity is restored. The mechanism is specific. A smart home is not a more capable home. It is a more dependent home. Every feature that makes it smart, its connectivity, its automation, its remote access, its data logging, requires three things simultaneously: power to the device, power to the router, and a functioning internet backbone. Remove any one of those three, and the smartness evaporates. Remove the first one, which is exactly what a grid collapse does, and what remains is a house full of inert plastic and glass that is, in several measurable ways, less functional than the house it replaced. A manual deadbolt cannot be hacked and cannot be remotely locked. A rotary thermostat with a bimetallic strip requires no internet connection to tell you the temperature. An analog smoke detector with a 9-volt battery does not need a cloud subscription to alert you to fire. The smart home represents perhaps the cleanest example of a purchase that creates the feeling of security while systematically replacing the actual mechanisms of security with digital dependencies that fail completely and simultaneously the moment grid power disappears. This one requires careful framing, because the chest freezer itself is not the problem. A chest freezer is a useful appliance. The problem is the specific practice, common enough to have been featured in countless prepper and emergency preparedness articles, blog posts, and YouTube channels, of using a chest freezer as your primary emergency food reserve. The logic seems sound. Buy in bulk. Freeze meat, vegetables, prepared meals. In an emergency, you have weeks of food stored in your basement. You are prepared, except that a chest freezer requires continuous power to remain a chest freezer. Without it, it is an insulated box. A good insulated box, a well-packed full chest freezer, can maintain safe temperatures for 24 to 48 hours after power loss. But at the 48-hour mark, the food begins to enter the danger zone. By 72 hours, in a typical home environment, the majority of protein stored in that freezer is either spoiled or approaching spoilage. The Northeast Blackout of 2003 generated the first large-scale modern documentation of this failure. The USDA subsequently updated its guidance on power outage food safety, specifically in response to the scale of food loss that event caused. Millions of dollars in frozen food were discarded across the affected region. Families who had spent weeks building up a food reserve discovered that the reserve had a single point of failure, the power connection at the back of the appliance. The 2021 Texas freeze extended this problem across a longer duration and colder ambient temperatures. In some cases, the cold worked in people's favor. Outdoor temperatures were low enough that food moved to garages or outdoors remained safe. But in the urban core, in apartment buildings, in homes without outdoor space, freezers became incubators once ambient temperatures dropped enough to disrupt refrigeration chemistry. The deeper problem is substitution. The chest freezer, once it became the primary food reserve, often replaced the alternatives. Shelf-stable food, canned goods, dry goods, root vegetables. These require no power. They do not spoil in 72 hours. They were what every household kept as a matter of course before refrigeration became universal. They were systematically displaced by freezer dependence, and the displacement was marketed as an upgrade. A $600 chest freezer stocked with $400 of meat that spoils in 48 hours without power is not emergency food storage. It is a system with a single catastrophic vulnerability at the worst possible moment. The generator is the purchase most specifically marketed as the solution to grid failure. And in narrow, specific conditions, the right size, properly installed, with adequate fuel on hand, it can be exactly that. The problem is the conditions under which generators are actually purchased, stored, and maintained by the typical middle-class household. After every major grid failure event in modern American history, the same sequence plays out. The grid fails. Within 4 hours, every hardware store, home improvement store, and box retailer within driving distance sells out of portable generators. Within 8 hours, gasoline lines form at every operational station, because gas stations require electricity to run their pumps. Within 12 to 24 hours, depending on the region and the cause of the outage, fuel availability begins to constrain. After Hurricane Sandy in 2012, gasoline rationing was implemented across New Jersey and parts of New York within 72 hours. The line stretched for miles. People waited 4 to 6 hours for gas. Several stations ran dry before the line reached the pump. Generators sat in driveways, idle, not because they were broken, but because there was nothing to put in them. The people who had generators but no stored fuel were in a structurally identical position to the people who had no generators at all. The fuel storage problem has its own complications. Gasoline degrades. Untreated gasoline stored in a standard container begins to lose volatility and develop varnish deposits within 30 to 60 days. A generator that sat in a garage for 2 years with stale fuel in the tank may or may not start when it's needed. The carburetor may be gummed. The fuel may not combust reliably. Fuel stabilizers extend shelf life, but most people who own a generator as a vague preparedness measure have not treated their stored fuel and have not run the generator recently enough to know whether it still starts reliably. There is also the installation question. A portable generator must be operated outside, away from doors and windows, to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning. This is not a precaution, it is a physical fact. Carbon monoxide is odorless, colorless, and lethal. The Consumer Product Safety Commission documented over 900 carbon monoxide deaths connected to generator use between 2005 and 2017, the majority following disaster events when people brought generators inside or placed them too close to ventilation openings in cold or wet weather. A generator operated incorrectly under stress is not a safety device, it is a lethal hazard. The mechanism is identical to the others. The generator is not a self-contained resilience tool, it is a node in a supply chain. It requires fuel, which requires distribution infrastructure. It requires maintenance, which requires knowledge and time. It requires safe operation, which requires conditions that an active emergency may not provide. Remove any of those inputs, and the generator in your garage is $800 of metal and plastic that is actively making your situation worse by giving you the false confidence of believing you were prepared. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The electric vehicle has been sold aggressively over the past decade on multiple premises: environmental responsibility, energy independence, lower operating costs, freedom from gasoline supply disruptions. That last one deserves particular scrutiny in the context of grid failure. The marketing logic runs: when the gasoline supply is disrupted, gas car owners are stranded, but EV owners simply plug in at home. This logic is coherent in exactly one scenario: a localized gasoline supply disruption that leaves the electrical grid intact. It is the opposite of coherent in a grid failure scenario. A fully charged EV at the moment of grid failure is a vehicle with a finite, non-renewable energy reserve and no means of replenishment as long as the grid remains down. A Tesla Model 3 with a 75 kWh battery has approximately 350 miles of range. That range is not renewable by any means available to a residential owner without grid power. A Level 2 home charger, the standard residential installation, requires 240-volt service that is completely dependent on grid power. A solar installation can trickle charge a vehicle battery under ideal conditions, but the charging rates typical of residential solar are measured in miles per hour, not kilowatt hours per hour in practical terms. Nowhere near sufficient to maintain a vehicle that becomes someone's primary evacuation or supply run asset during an extended outage. The February 2021 Texas freeze provided the first major documented stress test of this failure mode at scale. EV owners in the affected areas reported that cold temperatures, which reduce lithium battery capacity by 20 to 40%, combined with grid failure, created a situation where vehicles lost range faster than anticipated and had no means of replenishment. In some cases, owners who had planned to use their vehicles for extended periods discovered their available range had dropped to 40 or 50 miles before the grid restored. A gasoline vehicle during the same event faced its own challenges: fuel station pump failures and supply line disruptions, but crucially, gasoline can be transported in containers. A 5-gallon container of gasoline adds approximately 120 to 150 miles of range to a standard vehicle. It can be acquired from a distant station, from a neighbor, from a supply cache. The fuel is portable and transferable. An EV's energy reserve is none of those things. It is fixed in the battery. It cannot be supplemented by anything available at the residential level when the grid is down. And if the grid failure is extended, the 2021 Texas event lasted up to 9 days in some areas, the finite energy reserve in that vehicle represents a hard ceiling on the total transportation available to that household until power is restored. There is a deeper structural point here. The EV is the most grid-dependent major purchase a middle-class household can make, not because it is poorly designed, but because its entire operational model is built on a single assumption that grid power is continuously available. That assumption is the foundation beneath every calculation about range, about cost, about convenience, about freedom. Remove that assumption for 72 hours, and the vehicle that was supposed to represent energy independence becomes the most energy-dependent object in the garage. This category is the most serious, the least discussed, and the one most likely to have been invisibly installed in your home without you fully understanding its grid dependency. The category includes home medical equipment, CPAP machines, home oxygen concentrators, insulin refrigeration systems, electric nebulizers, powered mobility devices, as well as modern safety infrastructure, hardwired smoke and carbon monoxide detectors without battery backup, medically monitored alert systems, electronic prescription refill systems, and the digital health records infrastructure that emergency rooms depend on. Start with CPAP machines. Sleep apnea affects an estimated 22 million Americans. A CPAP machine requires continuous power to function. Most do not have built-in battery backup. Some can be purchased with battery accessories, but the majority of units sold for home use are designed for grid-powered bedside use. During the 2003 Northeast blackout, OR visits for cardiac events and respiratory issues spiked noticeably in the hours following the outage, partly attributable to the heat, partly to exertion from stairs in buildings with no elevator, and partly to the population of patients who had missed one or more nights of medically required respiratory support. Home oxygen concentrators, used by patients with COPD, post-COVID pulmonary conditions, and other chronic respiratory diseases, require continuous grid power to function. They cannot run on standard portable batteries for more than a few hours. The oxygen concentrator does not have a reserve tank to draw from while waiting for power. When it stops, the patient is dependent on whatever supplemental oxygen is in a portable tank, if they have one, or is without supplemental oxygen. Insulin storage is a critical and underappreciated vulnerability. Insulin must be kept refrigerated between 36 and 46 degrees Fahrenheit for unopened vials, or it degrades and becomes less effective, sometimes within 24 hours of temperature exceedance. A refrigerator without power maintains safe temperatures for approximately 4 hours. After that, insulin stored inside is potentially compromised. The 2021 Texas freeze resulted in documented deaths among insulin-dependent patients whose medication spoiled during the extended power outage. These deaths were not spectacular. They were quiet. They happened inside homes that had heat for the first 12 hours, then didn't, and refrigerators that maintained temperature for 4 hours, then didn't, and insulin that was fine until it wasn't. The digital health records infrastructure failure is less immediately dramatic but significant in ways that compound over 72 hours. Modern emergency rooms run on electronic health record systems. Pharmacies operate through digital prescription networks. Medical history, allergy records, medication lists, all of it lives in systems that require power to access. During extended outages, hospitals activate backup power for critical care systems, but the depth of that backup and the duration it can be sustained varies. After 72 hours of grid failure, even facilities with backup generators face fuel supply constraints. The mechanism here is the one that makes this category different from the others. The other 4 purchases, the smart home, the freezer-based food storage, the generator without fuel, the EV, represent failures of convenience and preparedness. Inconvenient, expensive, frustrating. This 5th category is different. Grid-dependent medical infrastructure doesn't just become useless in an extended grid failure, it becomes a source of acute medical risk for the most vulnerable people in the affected population. And here is the cruelest structural point. These devices were prescribed or recommended by medical professionals, purchased through insurance systems, approved by regulatory bodies, and installed in homes specifically because they were necessary for health and safety. They were the most responsible, most medically indicated purchases their owners could have made. And their failure mode in grid-down conditions was not disclosed at the point of sale, not explained at installation, not mentioned in the device literature with sufficient urgency to prompt the purchase of backup power systems. The medical establishment prescribed the devices. No one prescribed the resilience architecture those devices required. Step back from the 5 categories. Smart home systems, freezer-based food storage, gasoline generators without fuel supply chains, electric vehicles as primary transportation, grid-dependent medical and safety devices. What do they share? They are all deeply architecturally dependent on the continued function of a single infrastructure layer, the electrical grid. And they are all purchases that were framed in their marketing, in their cultural positioning, in the advice given by friends and family and consumer review sites as upgrades, as improvements, as signs of being prepared, being modern, being responsible. But every one of them exchanged one kind of resilience for another kind of dependency. The manual lock for the smart lock, the shelf-stable pantry for the chest freezer, the analog vehicle for the EV, the simple on-demand oxygen tank for the concentrator. Each upgrade created a more capable, more efficient, more feature-rich system within the parameters it was designed for, and created a complete, total, simultaneous failure mode the moment those parameters were violated. This is not the fault of the devices. It is a structural consequence of building technology on a foundation of guaranteed infrastructure. The devices work exactly as designed. The design assumed the grid would always be on, and the people most exposed are not the reckless or the unprepared. They are the people who prepared with the tools they were sold. They bought the smart home because it was marketed as safer. They stocked the freezer because it was marketed as preparedness. They bought the EV because it was marketed as resilient. They installed the medical devices because their doctors prescribed them. They followed the advice of every credible institution in their lives. And the advice was correct, given the assumption that the grid would hold. The problem is that the grid does not always hold. Since 2000, the United States has experienced dozens of grid events, affecting more than 500,000 customers each. The events are increasing in frequency and severity. The infrastructure is aging. The climate is producing more extreme weather. The threat surface for cyber attack on power infrastructure is documented and growing. A 1 in 3 chance of experiencing a significant grid disruption over a 30-year period is not an extreme estimate, it is a conservative one, and yet the entire consumer infrastructure market, the smart home industry, the food storage industry, the EV market, the home medical device market, none of it is designed around that probability. It is designed around the assumption of reliable power, because reliable power is the condition under which all of those products are most profitable, most convenient, and most marketable. The system that sells you these products is the same system that benefits from the infrastructure assumption those products depend on. It has no incentive to warn you, it has every incentive to sell you another upgrade. The historical record of grid failure events is shorter and less dramatic than the record of currency collapses, but it is consistent. After the 2003 Northeast blackout, after Hurricane Sandy, after the Texas freeze, after every extended regional outage documented in the modern era, the households that managed best were not the ones with the most technology. They were the ones with the least dependency. They had food that didn't require refrigeration. Not because they'd given up convenience, but because they'd maintained both the convenience of the freezer and the insurance of the pantry. They had mechanical locks that worked without power. They had vehicles that could be refueled from portable containers. They had medical contingency plans that included battery backups, portable oxygen, and medication coolers that didn't depend on the household grid. They had relationships with neighbors, people who knew each other, who pooled resources, who checked on the elderly and the medically vulnerable on day one, rather than waiting for an official emergency declaration. They weren't preppers in the cinematic sense. They were people who had, by choice, or by habit, or by cultural inheritance, maintained a layer of infrastructure beneath the electrical infrastructure. A layer that didn't go dark when the grid did. The lesson is not don't buy the smart home. It is not don't buy the EV. These are not binary choices. The lesson is the same one that economic collapse teaches, applied to a different timescale. Every purchase that increases your dependence on a single infrastructure layer creates an exposure, and exposures compound. 5 purchases that each individually depend on the grid are not 5 separate risks. They are one risk expressed 5 times simultaneously, activated by a single event, failing at the same moment. That is not resilience, that is concentration. And concentration, in every documented analysis of system failure, financial or physical, is the mechanism of catastrophic loss. It is now August 17, 2003. The grid has been restored across most of the affected region. David is standing in his garage in Detroit. The blackout lasted 54 hours for his neighborhood. He lost the $400 of meat in his chest freezer. The generator never ran because the replacement part was unavailable. The smart security system spent the entire event offline. His EV, he didn't have one. This is 2003, but his neighbor bought one in 2022, and during a 3-day outage last year, it sat in the driveway with 23 miles of range would have been effectively stranded. David is fine. His family is fine. He has been inconvenienced rather than endangered, which puts him in the majority of 2003 blackout outcomes. But David has learned something about the difference between what felt like preparation and what actually constituted preparation. The expensive purchases did not protect him. The inexpensive habits, the case of water, the canned goods, the battery-powered radio, the relationship with his neighbor 3 doors down who had a gas camp stove, those were what made 54 hours manageable rather than dangerous. He spent $600 on the chest freezer, he lost $400 in food. He spent $800 on the generator that never ran. He spends $45 a month on the security monitoring that went dark at hour 1. He did not spend $30 on fuel stabilizer and stored gasoline. He did not spend $50 on a battery-operated carbon monoxide detector with a 10-year lithium backup. He did not spend $200 on shelf-stable food that would have made 3 days manageable without any power at all. This is not hindsight. The information existed. The failure modes were documented from previous events. The grid had already failed catastrophically in 1977 in New York, in 1998 in Quebec, in the ice storms of 1998 across the Northeast. The pattern was already in the record. The record was ignored because the products sold on the basis of grid dependency were more marketable, more profitable, and more culturally validated than the simple, unglamorous alternatives. A chest freezer is an upgrade. A pantry stocked with canned goods is something your grandmother had. One feels like progress, the other feels like regression. But when the grid fails, the pantry outlasts the freezer by 70 hours. There is a tendency to think about grid resilience as a niche concern, something for the extreme preparedness community, something for people who live in rural areas or disaster-prone regions, something for a specific kind of personality, the kind that stockpiles and worries and reads the wrong kinds of websites. This is a comfortable framing, and it is wrong. The 2003 Northeast blackout affected 55 million people in one of the wealthiest, most developed corridors in human history. The 2021 Texas freeze affected 4.5 million households in the 10th largest economy on Earth. The 2012 Sandy outages lasted up to 2 weeks in some areas of New York City. Not a rural backwater, but one of the most densely serviced urban environments on the planet. The vulnerability is not geographic or demographic. It is architectural. It is the architecture of a society that built everything on the assumption of continuous power and then continued to deepen that assumption with every new device, every new upgrade, every new smart system installed on top of the previous one. The question is not whether you will experience a 72-hour grid failure. The question is whether the purchases you've made in the name of progress and preparedness will help you through it or will sit there silent and useless, reminding you of what you spent and what it bought. The pattern is already in motion. It has always been in motion. The grid fails somewhere every year. It will fail in more places, more severely, more frequently than it has before. The infrastructure reports say so, the climate data says so, the cybersecurity briefings say so. The question is never whether the system will fail. The question is whether you will recognize what you actually own before the moment it matters. This channel doesn't predict the future. It dissects the past so the patterns become visible before they become personal. The 2003 blackout is in the record. The 2021 freeze is in the record. The failure modes are documented. The purchases that failed are listed. The ones that held are listed too. The information is already there. It's just not in the catalog of things that were sold to you. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.